All right, hey everyone. So the purpose of this video is just to talk a little bit about how to organize data after you collect it. And so we're finally moving on from kind of these silly definitions that just had the words in the definition and talking a little bit now about, so once we measure all of the variables on our cases, how are we going to actually record all of that information? And so we're going to record it in something called a data matrix. And so this is just a convenient way to store data such that the shape of the data is rectangular. And so by the shape being rectangular, we just mean like for our stent stroke study, let's say that we recorded whether or not the person got the stent, whether or not the person got the stroke. This might be patient one. Maybe patient one got the stent and also got a stroke. Then we go to patient two. Maybe they had the stent but didn't get a stroke. All the way down, I think there were a total of 452 patients, maybe 552 patients. So all the way down to the last patient in the study, maybe they didn't have a stent, but they did have a stroke. And so by rectangular, we just mean that like you could kind of draw like a nice little rectangle around all of your data. And so that's what rectangular means. We also want to record data typically so that it's what's referred to as tidy. And so tidy just means that we want to put the cases on the rows. So remember the cases were patients, and so those go on each row, and variables on the columns. And so in this case, our two variables were whether or not the patient had a stent and whether or not they had a stroke. Those go on the columns. And so let's kind of think about collecting some data as an example. And so let's suppose that maybe you wanted to collect some data on your closest family and friends, whoever those people might be, whether or not they prefer to play a video game or read a book. And then you also want to record their favorite school subject. And we're just going to say around the age of 12. Um, and so maybe you might be interested in looking at this later to see if there's some sort of association between what people liked as a school subject as a kid and whether or not, now that they're an adult, whether or not they prefer to play a video game or read a book if they have an hour of free time. And so let's start just to see how you wouldn't want to record this data, just as an example. So let's say I'll just do myself first. And so let's say in an hour of free time, I would prefer to play a video game, and then I'll kind of do my siblings. So my brother would prefer to play a video game, but I know my other two brothers and sister would all prefer to read a book. I could do the same thing with subjects, and so my favorite subject, so what a shocker, was math. Stats wasn't available as a middle schooler, but I loved math, and I don't actually really know what their favorite subjects were, but I'm going to make some up. Okay, and so notice here that the way we've recorded this data, you will see data recorded like this, but it's not rectangular and it's not tidy because the um, variables, which are whether or not you prefer a video game or a book, that should just be one thing on the column, and the rows are not the cases. And so in this case, the cases are people. And it's not rectangular. It's this weird thing that doesn't make any sense, and it's awful and it's terrible. And the reason you don't want to record data like this is because most statistical software won't want it in this form. So if you're trying to actually do an analysis with this data, it doesn't want this. It's yuck, 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 yuck. Terrible, terrible, terrible. So how we would record this data so that it's rectangular and tidy is I'm going to think, okay, well, we have two variables. And so one variable is subject, so your favorite subject in school. The other I'm going to call video game or book. So that is just one variable. It has two levels, but those two levels don't constitute it being a completely separate column. And so now I'm going to put the cases on the rows. So I'm going to start with myself, math, video game, then I'll move to my brother. This is probably math, and video game, and we'll say English and book, and ooh, okay, let's say English. He didn't really like school, so it's kind of tough. And then, no. Oh, it's so tough. Okay, we'll say science and book. And so see, now this is kind of nice and rectangular. Later when we use software, most of the data that we'll use will already be in this format because that's what statistical software likes. Even, I know some of you might already be familiar with Excel, which is like kind of software, statistical software-ish. Even Excel would almost always prefer the data to be in this format as opposed to this. Okay, and so that kind of rounds out how we're gonna organize data. Next time we will start talking about different ways to collect data and some advantages and disadvantages associated with